We talk a lot about gaming PCs and custom water-cooled rigs like this one behind me on the channel, but I also have a little bit of a soft spot for Macs, especially a little bit more classic and older Macs. Let's talk about the 2013 Mac Pro. That's going to be the trash can Mac Pro. Is it useful at all in 2020? Let's talk about 5 positives and 5 negatives about using the Mac Pro in 2020. So let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology here. Thank you for joining me for another video. Remember to smash that like button, subscribe, leave a comment below. Are you using any of these older Macs? All right, so let's talk about the 2013 Trash Can Mac Pro. That's the nickname that was given to it because of its unique design that kind of makes it look like a trash can. Now, there's been a lot of chatter about the 2019 Mac Pro, which can get pretty ridiculously expensive. But if you search on the used market, you can find an older 2013 Mac Pro for considerably less than the newer Mac Pro. So let's talk about 5 reasons why it may still be good in 2020 and then 5 reasons to avoid it. The first reason why this may still be pretty decent in 2020, I've actually been testing out a pretty spec'd out model that I bought on the secondhand market. Now this is going to have the 12-core processor. It's going to have the dual D700 GPU. It has a 1 terabyte SSD drive for your operating system and anything else you want to put on it, as well as 64 gigabytes of RAM. Now, I've been testing this out mostly for video editing. Of course, I don't recommend gaming on any Macs, even sort of the newer ones. If you want to game, definitely go on the PC side. So I've been testing out Final Cut Pro 10, and I compared it to an iMac Pro, which is newer and also more powerful. And surprisingly, it does do fairly well on a lot of footage. It plays it back pretty smoothly, such as if your footage is in ProRes, it's going to work considerably more. If you try to throw certain codecs at it, like from the Canon R5 or even some newer cameras, it's definitely going to be a whole different ball game. It's going to have a lot more trouble. It actually managed Canon's 8K RAW. It wasn't really terrible at all. Of course, you have to put on better performance mode. Played fairly smoothly. I also tried 6K Red Cold RAW on it, and that also played surprisingly well. I was able to export and move things around and do certain effects. For a computer that came out in 2013 with those specs, I'd consider that to be pretty good. Of course, with certain codecs, it's going to get a little bit choked up. It doesn't have the T2 chip or the newer, GPUs, like the new Navi GPUs that are in the new iMac, as well as the new 10 core. So those newer computers will definitely beat it performance-wise. But if you like working with these older Mac Pros, there definitely still is some pretty good performance to eke out of them, depending on the application that we're doing. And then to counterbalance that, let's talk about one reason why you should avoid the 2013 Mac Pro in 2020. Basically, that's going to come down to the performance. While yes, it can still do pretty reasonably well, like we mentioned before in Final Cut Pro 10 and different apps that are really optimized for the Mac, in general, most newer Macs, even some of the Mac Minis as well as the MacBook Pros, they're going to beat the 2013 Mac Pro in most tasks that you can throw at it. Even if you're comparing something like the Mac Mini 6-core processor versus the Mac Pro's 12-core processor, there are a lot of cases where the Mac Mini is still going to be faster. I mean, it's going to be a much newer machine, came out around 5 years later. A lot of these newer Macs that kind of beat the Mac Pro in performance are going to be either kind of equal to the Mac Pro's used price or maybe even a little less in some cases. So just keep that in mind. It's definitely not going to be the most performant PC for the price. So you really have to have a little bit of a special affinity with the Mac Pro in order to be using it in 2020. The second reason why I think the Mac Pro is still pretty usable in 2020, it's not necessarily the most upgradable computer ever, but you can definitely upgrade it. It's very easy to sort of open it up, switch out the RAM, you can switch out the hard drive, even the graphics cards as well as the CPU. So it's fairly upgradable. Just keep in mind with some things such as the GPU, you're going to have to use pretty much only 3 different GPUs, either the D300, which is the base model, the 500, or the 700. So you're basically just limited to those, but you can definitely upgrade it. So if you like to tinker with it, I think that may be a positive for you. You can definitely change things around, and you can at least keep the system fairly updated and fairly at least competitive with some other Macs of today. A second reason why the Mac Pro may not be so good in 2020, as of right now, Apple still supports all of the new operating system updates on it, such as Catalina, even Big Sur that's coming out. but it's kind of getting at the end of the list. It's going to be over 7 years soon. So I don't know when Apple may decide to stop pushing software updates to that Mac Pro, just like they did with the original Power Mac, the G5, and then the Intel Mac Pro that came after it. There will come a point that Apple's going to stop supporting it. So if you're going to be trying to future-proof your Mac, this is not going to be the best one to go with. You'll be okay for 2020. Like I said, Big Sur definitely is going to work well, but we don't know about next year's update, so you may be a little bit limited in that regard. And of course, with new software updates, you always get a lot of optimizations that can help these older systems. So it's definitely a big deal when Apple stops supporting them, not only for the performance, but also for the everyday usability of systems like this. So let's talk about the third reason why I think the Mac Pro is pretty usable in 2020, and that's going to come down to their outdated Thunderbolt 2 ports. Now, they're outdated because Thunderbolt 3 is out, and there's not too much stuff that natively is Thunderbolt 2, but you can get Apple's Thunderbolt 2 to Thunderbolt 3 adapter, and you can definitely fit a lot of external peripherals on this Mac Pro. It's not going to work as fast as something like an iMac Pro, which has Thunderbolt 3, but even though Thunderbolt 2 is around half the speed of Thunderbolt 3, you can connect various docks to it that's going to give you more USB ports as well as external hard drives. So even though you don't have too much space inside the actual computer to sort of upgrade it, you can definitely add these external solutions. A lot of them you can move on to different systems. So it's not like you're throwing upgrades at the computer that may be outdated soon and you're going to get rid of it. You can reuse those docks and those USB drives. So that's definitely a positive. That was one of Apple's selling points when this Mac first came out. They wanted a small unit that you can sort of infinitely upgrade. Now you're going to be a little bit limited by Thunderbolt 2, but like I mentioned, there are definitely solutions. There are a decent amount of USB ports, and there still are some Thunderbolt 2 peripherals that you can pick up that's going to help you with that. The third reason you may want to avoid the 2013 Mac Pro, it's going to come down to price. These really haven't tanked in price all that much compared to what they were even a few years ago. Now, of course, it's much cheaper than when they were new, but when the 2019 Mac Pro came out, those were so expensive that the people that have this trash can Mac Pro either decided to hold on to them, or other people were buying them because they couldn't afford the more expensive Mac Pro. So they definitely held some of their price, and that's definitely going to be a negative. You're going to start to compete with those other iMacs and those other MacBook Pros that may be very similarly priced, but with much newer technology, and it's going to perform a lot better. So that's definitely one caveat that you should look out for. The 2013 Mac Pro that I got, that was pretty much maxed out with, most of the specs, 64 gigs of RAM, terabyte SSD, as well as the D700s and a 12-core processor. I was able to pick that up for under $2,000 in very nice condition. So it's not like it's extremely overpriced. Some of them with similar specs I've seen priced all the way up to $3,000. So you really have to look at your local market, see who's selling it. Some people are going to be asking more for it, $2,500 to $3,000, but I've seen these go for as low as $2,000, even a little bit under, like I mentioned before. So it's definitely possible to get it a little bit cheaper. Personally, just really like the way these are designed and the way you interact with them, because if you spec out a Mac Mini, it very quickly gets up to $2,000 or even a little bit more. If you want to use it for video editing, you have to add an external GPU or something like that. So definitely the price gets a little bit high for such an old computer, but also, even though that's a negative when you first purchase the computer, it's more expensive than even some newer Macs. On the plus side, you're going to be able to probably resell it at a later date without losing too much money, because I think these are probably going to maintain their values fairly well over the next few years, considering the 2019 Mac Pro is so expensive. The fourth reason why I think the 2013 Mac Pro is still pretty interesting in 2020, it's such a small computer, and lately we've had this whole big craze with mini ITX PC builds, gaming PCs, as well as smaller and smaller computers with more and more power. And while this one is a fairly old computer by computing standards, it's basically 7 years old, it's extremely small. You can fit it in your backpack. You can sort of, move it around very easily, pick it up with one hand. All you need to do is plug in some peripherals as well as a monitor. So a negative side of having a system like this, you're just really, really limited. A lot of professionals moved away from the Mac in terms of the professional environment and went towards PCs just because you really couldn't upgrade it beyond what's available to it. There was only Thunderbolt 2, and especially now. Who knows how long we may get software updates for a computer like this. So you definitely have a very limited upgrade path. But at the same time, if we translate this over to the fourth positive aspect of owning this computer in 2020, because of those limitations, it's challenging for the enthusiast that likes to tinker, likes to mess around with a little bit older hardware, just to try to get it working with modern standards. For example, you can actually connect via Thunderbolt 2 and eGPU, much like you can with Thunderbolt 3, like on a Mac Mini or a MacBook Pro. And while your performance is going to be limited compared to Thunderbolt 3, I've got it working before on Final Cut Pro 10, and that actually does give you a little bit of a performance boost depending on what type of files you're working with. And it's kind of fun doing these custom sort of installations, and it is fun as an enthusiast messing around a little bit with these type of installations that aren't like 100% supported. You have to sort of like run a script to make sure that everything works well. So if you like tinkering with these older Mac Pros, that's definitely a positive. You know, like we mentioned before with hardware, you can upgrade like the GPUs and the CPUs. You can definitely do a lot of tinkering with it, while somebody who's more in a professional environment, maybe they just want something that works. So for an enthusiast, I think the Mac Pro could actually prove to be pretty interesting. And finally, to summarize sort of a positive and negative in one, the reason to buy a Mac Pro like this in 2020, if you've been following Apple's releases over the last decade or even over the last 20 years, you probably have a soft spot in your heart for stuff like the G5 Power Mac, even the previous Mac Pro. So this is definitely, as a fan of some of Apple stuff, as an enthusiast, it's definitely really, really cool to own something like this, because it is a unique, a very beautiful design, both to the positives and to the negatives. It's such a small case. Of course, they were kind of restricted with their thermal flows, especially on their GPUs. But it doesn't mean that it's an absolutely stunning design. It's pretty crazy how everything fits in this little trash can enclosure. You know, a very powerful GPU and CPU, very uniquely designed machine. And it does have some problems with thermals. That's why they had to kind of change the design. But overall, I think if you have a little bit of a passion for a system like this, maybe not everybody does, but when you look at such a piece of computing hardware that's super unique, even as somebody who builds gaming PCs and water-cooled PCs, I can sort of respect the engineering that went into it and how impressive it is to put so much power in a small package. And even after 7 years, it's still a pretty competent computer for a lot of stuff that you're going to do. So I definitely wouldn't throw this in the trash by any means. I think it's still very capable. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, leave a comment below, and I'll see you guys on the next video.